Response to King Yaqub's video, Lunar Sabbath Nuked, Part 6, Festival of SHABUOTH. Hiram yashra'al, servant of Yahuwah and of the Master Yahushua HaMashiach, to the 12 tribes which are scattered abroad in the captivity, greetings. Brothers and sisters, in part 6 of this series here, we're going to be going through the festival of SHABUOTH. Now, this is a very important subject, and the reason why is because of the traditional way that people count the count to SHABUOTH. The traditional way is that we start on the day of the wave sheaf, and we count 7 Sabbaths, and one day afterwards we count unto 50 days. And so here you have 7 perpetually counted Sabbaths. You have one more day, you have 50 days. And so the reason why this is such a critical issue is that when you count count to SHABUOTH traditionally, that what that does justify a traditional seventh-day Sabbath count, where you count it perpetually every 7 days, whereas that does dispel a lunar count if you have to fit 7 Sabbaths within 50 days. So, sisters, and this was a point that King Yaqub brought up himself. He brought out a chart in showing how that it would be impossible to fit 7 Sabbaths within 50 days using the lunar count, because there would be a reset in there with the new moon, and that would throw the traditional count off. Well, my purpose in this video, brothers and sisters, is to show that counting 7 Sabbaths within 50 days is not the correct count to SHABUOTH. And so I'm going to support that with scripture by the helping favor of Yah. And the first place we're going to go to is Exodus chapter 34, verse 22. And here, this lays the foundation for everything else I'm going to say in this video. Verse 22 reads, "And perform the festival of SHABUOTH for yourself of the first fruits of wheat harvest, and the festival of ingathering at the turn of the year." So the first point of this video is that the festival of SHABUOTH is the first fruits of wheat harvest. Now, I emphasize wheat harvest because in modern times, that over in the land of yashra'al today, over in the secular state of Israel, that they have 2 wheat harvests. They have a spring wheat harvest and a summer wheat harvest. The spring wheat harvest is where the wheat is planted in the winter, comes up in the spring, and then the summer wheat harvest is when the wheat is planted in the spring and comes up in the summer. They have both. And so they do have a wheat harvest that does come up around the time of the traditional count to SHABUOTH. But what I want to show you, brothers and sisters, in this second point is that the scriptural wheat harvest is not the spring wheat harvest, but it's the summer wheat harvest. And so the first place that we're going to go is in Exodus chapter 9. Now, what's going on here is the plagues are being poured out, and the plague of hail is being poured out. Now, you see the reference of verses 22 through 26 here in Exodus chapter 9. Now, you can read that on your own, but that just basically says that this hail was so severe that it killed everything it came into contact with. Man, beast, broke trees, killed plants, and everything in its path. But I'm going to read verses 31 and 32 out of Exodus chapter 9. The word reads, "And the flax and the barley were smitten, for the barley was in the head and the flax was in the bud, but the wheat and the spelt were not smitten, for they were late crops." So here we have it. I mean, this is in the land of Mitzrayim or Egypt, which is walking distance from the land of Yashra'al. So agriculturally speaking, it was very similar circumstances. And here we see that the wheat and the spelt were not affected by this hailstorm. Why? Because they were in the ground. They hadn't sprouted up like the barley and the flax had. And so if this was the spring wheat that's planted in the wintertime, this would have been destroyed like everything else. But this was in the ground, and so it was not smitten by this cattle-killing hail. That's the first point that I wanted to make, showing that this wheat they're talking about here is summer wheat. It's not spring wheat. It's summer wheat. Second thing I want to show you here is in Nehemiah. Nehemiah chapter 13. Nehemiah chapter 13, verse 15. The word reads, "And in those days I saw in Yehuda those treading wine presses on the Shabbat, and bringing in sheaves and loading donkeys with wine, grapes, and figs, and all kinds of burdens, which they brought into Jerusalem on the Shabbat day. So I warned on the day they sold food." So look at what's going on here, brothers and sisters. They were treading wine presses, bringing in grapes and figs. Now, grapes and figs are clearly summer crops. They're not harvested in the spring. They're harvested in the summertime. And so they had grapes, they had figs, they were treading wine presses, but they were also bringing in sheaves. And so this is talking about the summer wheat harvest, brothers and sisters. This isn't talking about some spring harvest. This is the summer, because we see these other summer crops coupled with it. Now, John chapter 4. And this is Hamashiach himself speaking. In John chapter 4, verse 35, the word reads, "Do you not say there are still 4 months and the harvest comes? See, I say to you, lift up your eyes and see the fields, for they are white for harvest already." And so that first part where he says, "Do you not say there are still 4 months and the harvest comes?" If you search out the context of this statement, you'll see that he was in the first month when he made this statement. And he was talking about there being 4 months to the harvest. Well, from the first month to the time of the summer wheat harvest is approximately 4 months. That's why he made that statement. And so he was in the first month, so he wasn't talking about the barley harvest. And we only read about 2 major harvests in the scriptures amongst the children of Yashra'al. We read about the barley harvest, which takes place in the spring, and then we read about the wheat harvest, which takes place in the summer. And so, once again, the wheat harvest that Yahushua himself was making reference to here was the summer wheat harvest, not spring, but summer. So, I said that to lay the foundation for the last point that I want to make, and that is in Leviticus chapter 23. Leviticus 23. I'm going to read 2 verses to you here. The word reads, "And from the morrow after the Shabbat, from the day that you brought the sheaf of the wave offering, you shall count for yourself 7 completed SHABUOTH. Until the morrow after the 7th Shabbat, you count 50 days. Then you shall bring a new grain offering to Yahuwah." So you notice in verse 16, even in the Bible that I read from, it says, until the morrow after the 7th Shabbat, you count 50 days. And that's how most Bibles read. But brothers and sisters, that is a mistranslation. That it should not say until the morrow. And I'll show you one reason why. If you look at verse 15, if you have a Hebrew lexicon, or you could even use your Strong's Concordance for this, the phrase "from the morrow" in verse 15 is min mechorath. Min mechorath. I don't have that written up here on the screen, but that is the Hebrew rendering for from the morrow. Do you know that in verse 16, it is the exact same rendering? Min mechorath, or it'll say ad min mechorath. It is the exact same rendering in verse 16 that the translators translated until the morrow. Question: why'd they translate it from the morrow in verse 15 and then translate it until the morrow in verse 16? I mean, could the first people who translated this, could they have been affected by tradition or the way that people were just doing it at that time? I don't know. I don't know what their motives were, but what I do know is that they took the same Hebrew phrase and they translated it two different ways in these two verses, when in all actuality, where it says until the morrow, it should say from the morrow. So from the morrow, after the seventh Shabbat, you count 50 days. In other words, the 50-day count begins after the count of 7 Sabbaths. So you do not have to count 7 Sabbaths within 50 days, but you count 7 Sabbaths, and it's from the morrow after the 7th Sabbath, you count 50 days. Now, you may hear me say that and say, well, that's just your interpretation of it. But check out the Hebrew wording of that, and my hope is that you could at least see the possibility that it could be something else. But here's the deal, brothers and sisters. Which is it? Is it from the morrow or is it until the morrow? That's why I laid the foundation with points 1 and point 2. So the answer is this. It's whatever rendering squares with the rest of the scriptures. Which rendering squares with the summer wheat harvest, with Shabuoth being the first fruits of wheat harvest, which I have shown you scripturally is the summer wheat harvest, not the spring wheat harvest. Which of these renderings, from the morrow or until the morrow, which of these squares with the scriptural summer wheat harvest? Is it counting it within 50 days? And then you end up in the spring, and so you have 2 spring feasts. You have unleavened bread and you have Feast of Weeks. So 2 spring feasts, and then you have a fall feast? Or is it more evenly spread out? You have a spring feast, a summer feast, and a fall feast. Well, brothers and sisters, it is the rendering of from the morrow after the 7th Shabbat, you count the 50 days. And so it's that rendering that aligns with the rest of the scriptures, brothers and sisters. It's that rendering that aligns with the summer wheat harvest, and that is the correct count to Shavuot. And when you count it that way, it says 7 completed Shabbathot, or 7 complete Sabbaths. And so when you count those 7 Sabbaths, and then you do have new moon days mixed in there, but at the same time, you don't count that toward your count to the Sabbath, and you don't have to fit that within 50 days. So that part of it generally ends up being a 51 or 52 day count. But then the 50-day count starts afterwards. That's a straight 50-day count there. So you have the 7 completed Sabbaths, which will end up being 51 or 52 days around in there. And then you have the straight 50-day count. But where you're going to land is at the first fruits of the summer wheat harvest. That is the rendering, brothers and sisters, that aligns with the rest of the scriptures. If you go with the traditional rendering, until the morrow after the 7th Sabbath, you count the 50 days, 7 Sabbaths within 50 days. You're not going to arrive at the summer wheat harvest. So there's more to be discussed on this issue. Please message me if you want me to go into more depth. I just hit the high points here. But brothers and sisters, I just wanted to give you something to chew on, because this is the first time some of y'all have heard this. So with that, I will say shalom.